Look, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John McCoy, who's a professor and director of the School of Mechanical and Material Engineering at Lindholm Endowed Chair in Material Engineering at Washington State University, and has an adjoint appointment at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. His professional career includes academia, 12 years here at WSU, 5 years at the National Lab, and 10 years at Raytheon in industry. At WSU, he leads the Nuclear, Optical, Magnetic, and Electronic Materials Lab and the Crystals and Semiconductors Group, both within the Institute of Materials Research. These groups develop materials solutions for energy, environment, and security applications. Over his career, he has worked on diverse engineering problems, including cryogenetics, composite structures, telescopes, optical ceramics, magnetic nanoparticles, ancient materials technology, and that's me, ancient materials.
Oh, good.
Nuclear fuels,
Subject to
single crystal growth, and glass development for optics and immobilization of radioactive waste. He holds degrees in material science from MIT, a BS, and MS and PhD from the University of Arizona. He's co-authored over 300 journal articles, book chapters, conference proceedings, public reports, and patents. He's a fellow of the American Ceramic Society, a fellow of SPIE, and an elected member of the Washington Academy of Science and a Fulbright Scholar. And on top of that, he's an Eagle Scout. I'll turn this over to John.
Holy God. No, but you knew that.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you about one of my favorite subjects, and certainly in the last few years, and that is nuclear, whether that's nuclear power and all the issues around that. And, if you've been paying attention, this has become more and more important, at least for our country, in the last even 12 months. So I'll say a little bit about that at the end. The timing of this talk was actually really good. Last week, I was able to guest lecture in a new class that we have in material science and engineering called Fission and Fusion Materials. And so I talked for 2.5 hours about radioactive waste management. I'm not going to do that today. I've also, spoken to the Honors College about this year. And then just 2 weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. at the American Nuclear Society meeting, which was quite interesting because the week started with the government closed, and there were a bunch of high-profile government people there speaking, including the Secretary of Energy. And by the end of the week, the government was open. So I know I like to believe that I had something to do with that. But in any case, there's no doubt that the issues around nuclear are important to our society and our world right now. And so I thought I would give you a few comments about that, and then hopefully you'll have lots of questions. So these are kind of the areas that I want to cover. I want to say a little bit about nuclear energy and the global distribution of energy sources. And then I'll talk about the elephant in the room, which is the Hanford site, and then say a little bit about the importance of Washington in this area. And then, some pretty, hot off the press information about what's going on in the federal government around policy. So if you don't know, it's interesting to kind of look at the main sources of power by state. There's some nice apps on your phone. I can share that if you're interested, that does this sort of in real time. You can look at electricity distribution, et cetera. But it probably wouldn't surprise you that in Washington State, most of our electricity comes from hydro, but there are quite a few states that have primarily coal or in many cases natural gas, and only a few where most of the power comes from nuclear. I'll draw your attention to South Carolina and Tennessee, two states where they are, I would hesitate to even say doubling down, tripling down on nuclear right now. And so I will be in Tennessee in 2 weeks. There's a big workforce meeting there at Vanderbilt University. So there's a lot happening, particularly on the eastern side of the US. And I don't remember if I have it in this presentation or not, but if you don't know, most of the nuclear reactors in the United States are on the east part of the country, and there's actually not very many out west. But historically, and that, you know, these numbers don't change very much. US electricity is about a quarter nuclear overall. But if you look at Washington, it's about 8%. And the reason for that is obvious, right? It's all the dams that we have, the hydropower. There's not as much incentive to really develop nuclear. At least in the past, there hasn't been. But you know, putting this in context of, you know, the kinds of issues that we face today, you know, energy obviously is on the top of the list, the environment and how that relates to waste, and I'll say something about that as well. But not to forget things like disease. And I'm not going to talk about nuclear medicine in this presentation, but I myself have benefited from nuclear medicine, and probably some of you here have as well. There's also benefits of, you know, desalinization and other things. But really what we have to think about as a society is nuclear technology in general a pro or a con in our future? Because it's certainly not universally accepted as a good thing, although it's moving more that way, particularly with the younger generation, which is a bit surprising to me, but it seems to be the case. So if you think about waste, what is waste? Well, I mean, when I started doing this kind of work maybe 15 years ago, I used to be very apologetic about working on nuclear because lots of people were not very favorable to that. And so I introduced myself not as somebody working on nuclear power, but as a highly paid garbage man. Because if you think about, you know, if your garbage, my garbage is going out today, if it didn't go out for, I don't know, a month or a year, or let's say 60 years, some of you would get a little bit upset about that. And so, you know, when we think about our consumer life, you know, whether it's drinking out of a plastic bottle or mining materials, which if you didn't hear, the Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Energy has reorganized in the last week. There is now a brand new office on critical materials, critical minerals. And so mining and you know, having onshore resources has become a new national priority, as I believe it should. But at the same time, and in this region in particular, you know, look at Idaho and parts of Washington, you know, we have 100 years of mining history where we didn't do a very good job of taking care of the byproducts of the process. And so, you know, regardless of what you think about, you know, consumerism, the fact of the matter is that we create waste by our very active living. And I would argue, and others argue more strongly than me, and I think I should articulate this, is that the nuclear, I would say, industry is probably more responsible, at least both legally and intellectually, for their full cycle of waste than any other industry. Certainly, you know, coal, petrochemicals, whatever. So, you know, whether or not you want to burn natural gas or you want to burn uranium, there's going to be a waste product. And if you think about carbon as being a waste product of fossil fuels, you know, whether or not you believe that CO2 is the end all of this planet, it is a waste product from generating energy. And so there's going to be a waste product no matter what we do. So regardless of which of these you pick, you have to think about life cycle cost to the environment, to society, dollars, whatever. And, it's really hard to get unbiased numbers on this. And when you look at some of the other things like wind and solar, and I'm not anti that. I mean, I have work in solar energy also, but the way that things are accounted for are a little bit problematic. Even if you want to burn coal, you're going to get radioactive waste. If you didn't know, I mean, and we have some geologists in the room, there's tons of uranium and thorium in coal. So you're going to create radioactive waste. So, just to like put nuclear power on the same footing as other energy sources. So if you don't know, and I'm sure you guys are all intelligent professors, so you know this, but there is a real motivation to use uranium as an energy source just purely from its energy density. One pellet and the size on that screen is about, well, that's bigger than the actual size. I mean, these things are kind of maybe half the size of your thumb. Per pellet is 1 ton of coal or 120 gallons of oil. So, the energy density is huge, for reasons that I won't get into. But, so then the other thing we have to think about, and this is a complicated chart, but this is the official one from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So I'll talk about it briefly. So we talk about something called the nuclear fuel cycle. And that fuel cycle goes all the way from digging the raw uranium ore out of the ground, which is on the left side here, which is called the front end. I don't think my thing will work on the screen. To extracting the useful element from the ore, to making it into fuel, to then burning it in the reactor at the top here, and then you burn it in the reactor. And then if you are the current United States, you just pull it out and you worry about what to do with it later. But eventually you're going to have to dispose of it somehow as waste. Other countries, and increasingly the US is reconsidering this, will normally they talk about it as reprocessing. I like to talk about it as recycling, because in fact, that is really what you're doing. About 95% of the uranium that is left after what they call spent fuel, which I prefer to call used fuel, comes out of the reactor. For reasons due to the microstructure of the fuel and some of the fission products that, are neutron poisons, so prevents the continued burnup of that fuel. You can take it out and you can recover a lot of that. And that's what's called a closed fuel cycle. What we have now is an open fuel cycle. But eventually, if you recycle that, you do end up with some radioactive material, which you then have to dispose of. So this is an illustration of the front end. You start out with some kind of ore, such as uraninite or pitch blende, which is uranium dioxide. And the fissionable isotope of uranium is uranium-235, and the natural concentration is quite low. It's about 0.5%, and we need to enrich that to, let's say, a minimum of 5% for the current power reactors, and some of the advanced reactors maybe as much as 20%. And that's done primarily using centrifuge technology, where they convert the uranium to gas, and then they use the different masses of these uranium isotopes to separate out the uranium-235. And then that gas is then converted into back into an oxide. You get something called yellow cake, which is yellow, but it is a more oxidized form of uranium. And then it is reduced back into the black form when it's made into pellets. And we've done this in my lab as well. And then those pellets, which are about the size of a thimble, are stacked into tubes, and the tubes can be different materials, but most of the ones that are made at Framatome, which is in Richland, are a zirconium alloy, and they're put into fuel assemblies. Those fuel assemblies are put into reactors. If you're interested, and I have this at the end as well, there's a lot of really good popular books about this. This one that I'm showing here by Tom Zellner is something I picked up at the Smithsonian. It's a really good book. Talks about uranium supply. Yes, sir.
One question.
Yes.
If you touch a pellet, how hot is it?
I
mean, temperature?
temperature hot?
Yeah.
You won't feel it at all.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean it's an alpha decay, right? So it's going to be stopped by your dead skin.
Okay.
Now, if it's been in a reactor for 10 years and it comes out, that's
Right.
a different question. But if you're talking about as manufactured, you just wear gloves so that
Really?
you don't ingest
Okay.
it.
Yeah, thank you.
And so this is interesting. So where do we get a lot of our uranium? So the graph on the left is the raw uranium. You can see this is time on the x-axis, but a lot of it comes from Kazakhstan, and it has to do with the process they use to leach the soils, and I won't get into that. But a lot of it also comes from Canada right now, and I learned a couple of weeks ago that the company called Cameco, which is the ones that does a lot of the mining of uranium in Canada, actually bought Westinghouse a couple of years ago.
They're that big.
They own 49% of Westinghouse. It used to be owned by the Japanese, and then it was sold to a holding company who has 51% of it. But basically, they're talking about a global strategic North American fuel supply chain, which kind of blew my mind. But they have a lot better, higher grade uranium ore there. They already have existing mines, and so increasing the supply.
We have a tariff on there.
Well, I think there's always exceptions, right? I mean, you can make long-term deals. So that's the raw material, and then on the right side, you have the enriched uranium, right? Because now you have to get enough uranium-235 out of there, and that has more to do with the separation of the isotopes. So you can see about a quarter of it comes from the U.S., but even as of 2023, we're still getting more than a quarter of it from Russia. And so this is why you've seen so much investment in the last couple of years in new enrichment facilities. They're building one in Tennessee at Oak Ridge. They're also talking about building one in Richland. They're doing a pilot plant in Paducah in Kentucky that company is still thinking about, and I think they've bought some land already in Richland. So we're really, for geopolitical reasons, trying to onshore a lot more of the supply chain. And just last month, uranium was added to the U.S. Geological Survey's list of critical minerals. So, I think we're moving in the right direction there. This is a slide from somebody who's has an agenda, but Oklo is a small company that is really pushing reprocessing of fuel in the U.S. And so basically, they're making an argument that as of kind of 2032 at least, with the current projected production, we're going to have a deficit of uranium. And one of the reasons for not doing reprocessing has always been the argument that we have lots and lots of uranium, and it's too expensive to reprocess. But the argument here is that if you actually reprocess, so you get the uranium back, 95% of it, as well as some plutonium, you essentially have an infinite amount of fuel, as far as you could calculate. So there is a lot more interest than I've seen in 15 years of going back and perhaps considering fuel reprocessing again. And again, this is not new technology. This has been done by France for 40 years with good success, with robust industrial participation.
So this is saying demand is not being met, right?
That's what the argument is.
Okay.
And again, there's also a national security aspect as well. I mean, do you really want to buy your fuel from Russia? And as long as I'm on that subject, one of the things that I hadn't really thought about very much was the energy security, national security aspect of this, because there's actually a really good reason to export nuclear technology, because then the safeguards. And so safeguards are, how do you secure nuclear material that could be used for weapons, right? If you're exporting that technology to, I don't know, some country in Africa, the US has some control over how that technology is designed and licensed. Whereas if those same countries are getting their reactors from Russia, we don't actually know how that fuel is designed and the parameters of those reactors, et cetera. So there's actually a national security aspect of this. It's pretty important. So this is what light water reactor fuel looks like. I already kind of showed you, but these pellets are split into tubes. These tubes go into assemblies. This is something that's done in Washington in the Tri-Cities. There are a number of new kinds of fuel, and this is probably the most important one. It's called TRISO, which stands for triisotropic. It's been developed for at least 20 years in the National Lab System, and now many of the advanced reactors are using this kind of fuel. And the way to think about it is that it's your actual nuclear material is a tiny kernel in the center, and then you have these different layers around it. Of the sphere, think of it as a planet. The core is uranium carbide or uranium oxide, something like that, and then you have layers of carbon or silicon carbide, and a lot of these are what we call high temperature gas reactor designs, where you operate at higher temperatures, so the electricity or the thermal to electricity, because the conversion is better, because you're basically boiling water and turning a turbine, right, in these power plants. And so the pebble bed design, for example, has a bunch of these kernels, and they're built together into something the size of a tennis ball. And then you have a hopper of these tennis balls, and they move through the reactor. You put them in the top, they sort of move through for a certain amount of time, and then they plop out the end. And they're supposed to be considered one of the safest designs. There's really no reason to do any reprocessing right now, to do anything other than figure out a way to just bury these things because of their safety. The reason I include this is that they are going to start making this material in Tri-Cities. The Framatome, if you don't know, Framatome is a nuclear fuel company that is over kind of by PNNL on the northwest side of Richland, and they have partnered with another company called Standard Nuclear to start building this fuel, manufacturing this fuel. And the reason is, and I don't have it here. The reason is that the Energy Northwest, which is the Columbia Generating Station, is the reactor that we have in Washington. It's on the Hanford site. They have decided to build a set of small modular reactors at Energy Northwest, and they have partnered with a company called X Energy, which is based out of Maryland. And X Energy's design is a high temperature gas reactor that runs on TRISO fuel. And so they're going to build those reactors in Richland. They're going to build the fuel in Richland. And so, we're, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but we're kind of in the center of this, not as much as states like Tennessee and South Carolina. So a little bit about reprocessing, recycling. We don't currently do it. France, Russia, China, and India all do it. The UK used to do it. Japan also reprocesses. One of the arguments that has been given historically for not reprocessing is nuclear safeguards. But we have examples like Japan, who is not a nuclear weapons state, and we can talk about Japan later if you want. But We have international policies in place through the IAEA in Vienna to handle safeguards of countries that are not nuclear weapon states. So the diversion of plutonium issue is largely solved in modern fuel design. We talked a little bit about the economy, uranium being cheap and abundant. That might not be the case if we're going to be adding so many, more tens of gigawatts, hundreds of gigawatts in the US. The environmental one, we'll get to that in a minute, the repository issue. And then I've also heard the argument that, well, we can just put these fuel bundles in casks. And I don't think I have pictures of this, but essentially you pull the fuel bundles out, you put it in a canister, and then you put it in a concrete overpack, and it sits out on the pad at the nuclear site. And it's more or less stable for hundreds of years. And at that point, the radioactivity, certainly the heat generating radioactivity is significantly less. But I've heard multiple nuclear engineers say, just leave it on the pad. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the waste. Another good book recommendation. This one's actually a WSU Press book by a guy from, I think he was from Oregon State or University of Oregon. I can't remember. Came out maybe 15 years ago or so, but it talks a lot about the legal history of radioactive waste in the US. So it's very interesting. But this is the glorified garbage man picture that I used to show at the beginning of all of my presentations, which, as a man with his son, my sons are all taller than me now, so it's not relevant anymore. But it says, "One day, son, this will all be yours." By the way, radioactive waste doesn't look like that. There's no green gas. Thank Homer Simpson for that. But in any case, this is essentially what we inherited from, maybe my grandparents at this point, from the Manhattan Project. And we have, different kinds of waste as when you go to the landfill, you put your cathode ray tube TVs over in this pile and you put your brush over in that pile. Well, we have the same thing in radioactive waste. In the US, you have a separate category for SNF, which is spent nuclear fuel or used fuel. And then you have high-level waste. The only high-level waste that we have right now in the US are from reprocessing, mostly from weapons production, which is what Hanford is. Then you have low-level waste materials and other kind of classifications that we can talk about if you want. So here's where our high-level waste is in the US. It's primarily at 4 sites. The Hanford site, the Savannah River site in Aiken, South Carolina. There's some at Idaho Falls. And then there's a little bit at West Valley, New York, which is there because there was a prototype reprocessing facility in New York, which they completed all of the reprocessing. They vitrified all the waste, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then they decommissioned the whole site. And so that site was designed as a pilot plan, as a demonstration project, the West Valley demonstration project. And now it's almost completely decommissioned and returned. Not quite, but it's close. So if you're going to start out with some liquid radioactive waste, which you would have if you reprocess fuel, or in the case of Hanford, as you'll see, what am I going to put all that in to safely dispose of it? You don't want to leave it as a liquid, right? Because the liquid is just going to permeate into rock or whatever you put it in. So I got this from my colleague in the UK. So how long does it take for things to degrade? Well, if you leave a banana out, maybe a few weeks, plastic bag, maybe a couple decades, a can, whether this is tin or not, I need to change this. It's not a tin can, it's a steel can or whatever. But 50 years maybe. Plastic bottle, this is a big waste problem right now. A few hundred years maybe, although we don't have any plastic bottles that are that old, so we don't really know. But glass, at least 1 million years. We know this from geology. We can get into that if you want. And why do we need that time? Well, there's different arguments for the amount of time that you should have, but if you sort of roughly calculate the radioactivity after taking it out of the reactor, in 10,000 years, it will be about the same level of radioactivity that it was when you started with the uranium ore. So that's one number. There are longer numbers that have been designed for, in, for example, Yucca Mountain, which we'll talk about later. But the reality is once you get past about 10,000 years, your uncertainties in your analysis or your projection, your prognosis are so huge, it doesn't even make sense. But so glass has been selected starting in about the 1970s, selected by the international community, and for reasons basically that it was already a mature technology. Borosilicate glass was first discovered in 1887 in Germany, but by then 100 years later or a little less, it was a very mature industrial technology. Glass works really well in that it's very flexible to the kinds of elements that can incorporate, which you'll see in a minute why that's important. It's actually quite stable to radiation damage. So if you have internal radiation to the system, it's already amorphous, so you don't have to worry about the crystalline phases like becoming amorphous. And it's also quite chemically durable in contact with water, which is important for the long-term storage. So what does the Hanford waste look like? Well, there are formerly, and I have to be careful how I say this because my DOE program manager busts my balls every time I say this wrong. 177 tanks originally, of which more than 20 of them have been now emptied, the waste has been retrieved. The definition of what empty means is also a communications nightmare. But from 1943 to 64, there are about 150 of these that were made. The single shell, mild steel tanks that, there's a schematic shown here on the left. These are some photographs of the tanks being made before they were buried. So they're steel on the inside and then concrete on the outside. Some of them have leaked, as I'm sure all of you know. Then in the late 60s through the 80s, they built some 2-shell tanks, and we know that at least one of those is leaking. But what it looks like today, it just looks like a concrete pad with a bunch of stuff sticking out of it. What does the waste look like? This is the waste. There's really 3 types. There's what we call the supernatant, which is mostly sodium hydroxide and nitrates. And the reason for this is that they took the fuel out. The fuel was mostly aluminum-clad uranium oxide fuel. They then, and this is what they do in the Purex process for commercial reprocessing. Now they put it in nitric acid and to dissolve it in nitric acid. So there's a lot of nitrates in there. And then you're going to put it in a steel tank. You don't want to put nitric acid directly in there. So you basify it. So you add sodium hydroxide to reduce the corrosion on the tank. And so the actual remaining liquid is mostly water with some sodium and some nitrates, some hydroxide. When that supernatant evaporates, when the water evaporates, you get the salt cake. And so it's very similar composition, but you have more crystalline species. And then at the bottom, and again, in some cases, you can have all of these in all the tanks, but the tanks are all a little bit different. You have the sludge, which is like the poison brownie batter, which is about 50% water, which has most of the transition metals, as well as the transuranics, uranium, and some of the other things in an oxide or hydroxide form.
Oh,
Yes.
in the supernatant, what is the contaminant?
There's cesium in there.
Oh,
And so
is that it?
no, these are sort of like the main components. We have a process now, and I don't know if I have this slide in this presentation, but in the current process, we remove the cesium using an ion exchange. And there's also a filtration process that if there are any precipitates of radioactive materials, we remove those before it goes to the low activity waste vitrification. There is some iodine 129, which is really, really long half-life. There's also some technetium, which is the sort of biggest concern. Both of those are very, very long half-life. They sort of have a huge impact on the repository performance, the dose to public at long times. But to your point, compared to like when you reprocess, fresh fuel, the radioactivity on this is very low compared to that.
Right.
And so there's been a lot of debates about how we define this low activity waste. And I didn't go into this, but it turns out that the Department of Energy classification is different than the classification for commercial materials. And it gets pretty Byzantine, and we can talk about it if you want. But the low activity waste will all be disposed of on site at Hanford, or maybe some of it will be sent off site to a commercial, essentially engineered, landfill, which is what they'll have on site at Hanford. Is called the Integrated Disposal Facility, the IDF, which is already built, by the way, and some waste has already been put there.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is what's in the waste in the red. So basically the entire periodic table, minus a couple of things. In green are the things we add. So beyond that, there's not much else that wouldn't be there. However, in the bottom, and sorry, it's kind of small, but basically, if you look at this in terms of mass, most of it is sodium nitrate with some other anions, and then the kind of a smaller slice, even of that, most of it is aluminum phosphate. And so most of what the waste is actually not dangerous. It's just that what we have is a mixed waste. There's also organics in there. There's all kinds of other things, and it's too expensive to separate all that out. That used to be the process. There was going to be a building that did some pre-processing. And I'm happy to leave these slides if you want to look at this later, but there's the table that you can't read basically says where these different elements came from. But essentially, there's a few categories. There are process chemicals, because remember, Hanford was the first time they had ever separated plutonium from fuel, ever. And so they were figuring this out as they went along. So there's like 3 or 4 or 5 different processes that were used over decades.
So that's why there's such a big mix of things.
That's exactly right. And so there's process chemicals, which include, your halides or sulfate, because those are the acids they use. There's corrosion products. There's some iron and chromium from that. There's mostly aluminum from the fuel cladding, but there's some zirconium material there. And then there's all the fission products. I didn't talk about fission, but the fission spectrum of uranium-235 and other fissionable isotopes is like a double humped camel. So you have isotopes that are kind of at the 100 and at the 140, which peak there. So there's some rares, but the burnup was low, so there's not a lot of.
I noticed you put boron. I understand the boron in the glass, but you also mentioned lithium, adding lithium.
Yeah, so
That's interesting.
in some cases, okay, so when you formulate the glass, and again, I don't remember if I have this slide in here or not, so I'll just answer the question now. When you formulate the glass, there's a couple things you have to do. First, you have to be able to process it, and in processing it, you need enough electrical conductivity. And so this is done in a Joule heated melter, so you need some alkali to increase the electrical conductivity. You also need it to be stable long-term. So there's a product, constraint. And so in one of the issues that we have that's very specific to Hanford is that this glass, because it's high in sodium and aluminum, and we add silicon to it, it really likes to form sodium aluminosilicate rocks,
Okay.
which is not really good for us because what that does is it enriches the rest of the material in sodium borate, which dissolves in water. And so you concentrate the radionuclides in the sodium borate, which is bad. So one of the things I've worked on the last 15 years is how to prevent nepheline from forming, which is sodium aluminosilicate. How do you prevent that from forming in these? And one of the things you do is you substitute in some other cations like lithium.
Okay.
So there's some complicated answers to that question, but there you go.
Just out of curiosity, there were none of the helium series in the waste product. Why is that?
Well, because it all went away long ago. I mean, when you take fresh fuel, right? There's a lot of gaseous fission products, right? There's krypton, there's xenon, and so when you take fresh fuel and you process it, you have to take care of that. But this waste is so old that all those gases have long since. This
Gotcha.
is what I think.
Okay.
Have all since gone up the stack.
You were breathing them decades ago.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I won't tell anybody else.
Okay.
All right, so this is what the plant looks like. I had another picture that I liked better that was older that you could see Mount Rainier in the background, but this is the one my program manager says to use right now. This is the 2022 picture. But for example, the low activity waste facility is here, which is where they're vitrifying the waste right now. The high level waste facility is not completed yet. The pre-treatment plant, which was the initial flow sheet, will probably never be completed because they found a way to do the process better and faster and cheaper without doing that at all. But suffice to say this, and I've heard this on a number of occasions, although I don't have a citation for it, is that when completed, it will be the biggest chemical engineering plant on the planet.
But it won't be used.
Well, the pre-treatment facility will not be. The overall, what's called the waste treatment and mobilization plant, or the WTP. Okay, so this is the melter that's operating right now. So this is the low activity waste melter. It's the largest waste glass melter in the world. It is 5 times bigger than the one at Savannah River, which has been operating since the mid-90s. It has redundant caves, I think they call them. So the glass is poured out of this pour spout, and then the container sits down below the floor level. And these melters, they're lined with refractory material. The refractory is high chromium oxide, so there's an environmental problem just with making the refractory for this. And the melters are estimated to last about 5 years because there's, and I don't know if I have it on this slide. It's something like 150 tons a day, metric tons a day of glass that each one of these will produce. And so after 5 years, it kind of goes out on these rails. You can see in this picture here, and then they replace it with a new one. And it is in fact true that you can stand right by the melter for this low activity waste melter because the radioactivity is low enough that they can't go inside the melter like these guys are here where they're installing the refractory. But for the high level waste, it'll all be remotely operated. But for the low activity waste, they don't have to do that. But there's some really nice, movies and things online about this. If you're interested, the Hanford Vit plant has some good educational material on this.
I have another question.
Yes.
You may not know the answer to this, but this uses a lot of electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Do they generate all their own electricity on site, or do they use some of hydropower?
Do you mean,
know?
do they have their own power station?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that, but
Yeah, I was just curious.
I It's a good question.
Yeah.
I should really find that out because I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you.
So, and again, I have lots more details, but I didn't include it here. But this is from their site, but it's important to note here that they are actually doing this on real radioactive waste right now, starting on October 8th of this year. And this is a huge milestone for us because, you know, people had said this was supposed to start 20 years ago. And there had been many, many promises, but it's actually happening now. Yes, it's very low radioactivity, but we're taking that, if nothing else, we're taking liquid in cracked vessels, and we're putting it into a solid and putting it into an engineered landfill, which has got to be better than what it is now. So right now, the Bechtel is operating this plant. They had the contract to produce the plant, to build it and what's called commission it. So right now it's undergoing what's called hot commissioning, which means radioactive real tank waste. And so that hot commissioning is said to last from 12 to 18 months. And it started, the first waste was vitrified on October 11th. So in roughly the beginning of 2027, the contract will go to the other company called H2C, which is the Hanford Tank Closure Company, who is responsible for the integrated problem. So all of the tank waste and the waste treatment plant. Up to this time, there's been two main contractors, other than the dispositioning of a lot of the site. That's the Central Plateau Cleanup Company, I think it's called. But you had WRPS, which is now H2C, which is in charge of maintaining the tank farms. I still think it's crazy they call them farms, but whatever. The tank farms, but they will take over the entire process, and they'll be responsible for moving to the vit plant and vitrifying the waste. Now, the high level waste, the witch's peanut butter, brownie batter stuff, okay, that's a different compositional range, so it requires a different design of the glass. We know how to do it, but there's that part of the process is being essentially designed right now. So while we're doing the easy stuff, we're figuring out how to do the hard stuff. And really that's the only way to do this. And this is true with repositories as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I've already gone 45 minutes and I haven't even got to disposal yet. But this is why I don't have as many slides as I actually have with me. Okay, so now you've got the stuff and you got to do something with it. I told you that for the low activity waste that we're vitrifying at Hanford, that's going to go on site. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about what you have to do with the really radioactive stuff if we do reprocessing, because I think this country is moving that way. So if you think about this, so by law, we have to do this, by the way. But if you look at just a few isotopes, you look at uranium-238, the half-life of uranium-238 is 4.5 billion years. It's actually how we date the Earth's age. Uranium-238 is fissionable, but it's not fissionable. But you can use it in a fuel cycle if you give it a neutron, then it goes to uranium-239 and it will fission. But uranium-238 is the majority of the isotopes of uranium. But the long-lived ones that are not transactinides that we were concerned about, I mentioned before, iodine and technetium, are kind of 200,000 to 15 million years, and they will be radioactive for that long. And the reason we're more concerned about those is that iodine and the way that technetium is chemically in the environment is as an oxyanion, so TCO4 minus. Both of them are very, they move with the groundwater. And so those are the ones that we're most concerned about, and those are in actually low activity waste. So you've got to design something that's going to perform for, thousands of years. We talked about that at the beginning. I recommend this book by a guy named Vince Iolenti. And this book is about the Swedish repository system, which I'll mention in a minute. And he was an anthropologist, and he essentially spent several years in Finland. Did I say Swedish? I meant Finnish. He spent several years in Finland working with regulators and scientists and all of these people, and trying to understand how they conceptually design something over decades that is going to perform over millennia. So really fascinating book, especially for a geologist. But and I showed this at a talk earlier this morning. The way to think about this, okay, even 10,000 years is slightly after the development of agriculture. So projecting this in the future is a little bit hard to imagine, especially given the changes that we see in our technology, even in the last decade. So what have we done in the US, or what have we not done? And we have lots of low-level waste repositories, by the way, and some of them are in Texas, some of them are in New Mexico, there's some in Washington. But for high-level waste, we have to use a deep geological repository. We have one at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in New Mexico, but when that was developed, they had some deals that were made in order to host it there, so that it only has a certain kind of waste. It's called transuranic waste that can be housed there. So high-level waste cannot be housed there. You all probably know better than I do, like the changing environment around Yucca Mountain in Nevada. There's still a lot of, and I even saw this a couple of weeks ago, a lot of this not in my backyard mentality. The decision making is very long term. The construction times are really long, and it's a very, very highly political process. But I would say that there are other countries that are a lot farther along than us. For example, Finland, and I'll show you some pictures of this site in a minute, at Olkiluoto, in the western part of Finland, they will start emplacing spent fuel in 2026. Now, again, these countries are different. Finland and Sweden just take their fuel, they repackage it, and they put it in the ground. France reprocesses it, so they have mainly glass that they're disposing of. But Sweden is shortly behind. Will begin operations in 2030. France in 2030 also. In case you're interested, Finland and Sweden are both in what they call crystalline rock, which is mainly sort of granite, nice kind of material. France will be in clay. There are some advantages of clay in that it's very low hydraulic permeability. And so, things get in, can't get out. Canada had a big announcement this year that they have selected their repository. It will be in Northern Ontario in a community called Ignace. And that actually is on Indigenous land, and the Indigenous people, over a process of decades, decided to take responsibility for the radioactive waste of Canada. And so that will also be in crystalline rock. So it's the Ojibwe Nation that has that land there. So Switzerland has chosen their site. They're a little bit farther out, 2060 when they'll begin operations there. And the UK is actively doing site selection. They're expecting in a couple probably by next year to be down to 2 sites. And we can talk about how that process works if you want later. This is what Finland is doing, because they're going to be the ones that get there first. Essentially, they're taking the design that was that came out of Finland. So that here are your uranium pellets. They're in the tube still. Then they get slid. These fuel assemblies get slid into a canister essentially, and then there's a copper over canister. There's a plant that it's all remotely done, remote handled, robotic repackaging, because it's highly radioactive. And then these cans are placed into individual drilled holes for the canisters. And those are, in the case of Onculioto or Oncalo, about 500 meters down. And so these are essentially what are called mined repositories. And so they have some way to get everything down, whether it's a long spiral mined area. I've been down in this, so this is kind of what it looks like. You can drive. I mean, it's industrial mining, basically, underground hard rock mining. And they'll be the first ones in the world to actually accomplish this next year. So a little bit about Yucca Mountain. So and I'm sorry for all the words on these slides, but there's a lot of context here that I get wrong if I don't have these prompts. So the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 said that the DOE had to build, the Department of Energy had to build this geologic repository. And for reasons, in 1987, the amendments said that DOE had to direct their efforts to Yucca Mountain. And so if you're interested in the details on this, there's a book called Uncertainty Underground, which is actually quite technical, but it has some good policy stuff in it as well. But, what are the reasons, some of the reasons that have been given for, focusing on Yucca Mountain? The one you hear most often is that Nevada was politically weak. But there are some other reasons, like there was already some weapons test contaminated site there, right? The Nevada test site is there where the Trinity bomb was dropped. There are some technical characteristics of that were favorable, although if you talk to 5 geologists, you'll probably get 7 opinions on that. And so there were some, but actually you may not know that Washington was one of the, at one point, the Hanford site was one of the sites that was considered for this. And, what I saw, the technical reasons were that there were too many fractures in the basalts, but there were probably some political reasons as well. So we can, for whatever reason, the law currently says that our only option is Yucca Mountain until they change the law. Now, people say, well, we can't afford to do this. Well, that's not really true. Because in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, they created something called the Nuclear Waste Fund, which collected fees based on electricity that was generated from nuclear. And it was, $0.001 per kilowatt hour. So in 2014, they stopped collecting the fee because they had already defaulted on when they said they were going to have the repository in place to take this fuel from the commercial reactor companies. However, this fund already has $52 billion in it, $52 billion in it, and it earns $1.7 billion of interest per year. So this country has the money to do this project. What it doesn't have is the consensus, or as best consensus as we can get, of where to put it. And part of the problem is that we have something called states in this country, and each one of these states is kind of like a European nation. And there's a reason that there's no multinational repositories, although it's an interesting debate about this, at the American Nuclear Society meeting. And one thing that was said that was actually pretty interesting was, well, no, we do have an example now. Canada, you have a tribal nation working in concert with the Canadian government to have this long-term repository. So we have the money, and kind of what's the recent stuff. The last few years in Trump's first administration, they kind of kicked it down the road. there was some political maneuvering with President Obama where the license application was submitted, but then it wasn't reviewed. They completed the review and they published a report, but the process basically stopped. And there are some people that argue that they should just at least release saying, yes, it's okay, because it is okay, like technically. It's not a technical issue, although there are some that disagree. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who is responsible for deciding, says that it's okay. But it's just that there's one thing I heard from a politician was that Nevada is a swing state. And it's a swing state in both congressional elections as well as presidential elections. And so nobody wants to like piss them off. No administration wants to piss off Nevada and then risk losing Nevada in the next election. So there's some issues there. And you know, the examples that other countries have given us is that you have to like engage in a national conversation, and you have to have people that come and volunteer to be considered, and those people have to be compensated, and then they still have to have right of refusal. There's lots of examples of how this could work. I would argue that whether you're for or against nuclear energy, we still have to do this because we already have this material, right? So the only thing that you could do is kick it down the road to the next generation and let them worry about it, which seems a bit irresponsible. There are some places, including Washington, who have said they need to be carbon neutral. And you know, we have a roadmap to follow. And I think what will happen is that we will see other countries getting the job done, and hopefully we'll be shamed into making some progress. There have been a lot of people who've talked about what we should do now, including this report from Rod Ewing, who was at Stanford at the time, and he just recently passed away. But you know, there's been a lot of discussion about how to move this forward. A number of issues, one of which is create a different federal organization that is stably funded through the Nuclear Waste Fund, so we have the money for it, is not subject to appropriations, and so can do long-term fiscal planning, and is responsible cradle to grave, and not the DOE. Basically, the responsibility would be handed over. So what I was told is that this January, we should expect a new policy document to come out of the US Department of Energy. The American Nuclear Society, the Nuclear Energy Institute, a lot of these places, the Blue Ribbon Commission, which happened in 2013, have all said more or less the same thing. But we're supposed to see another document in January. I don't know what it's going to say, and I don't know, well, I probably know what it's going to say. It's probably going to say the same thing that I just said. Now, whether or not anything happens after that will be very interesting to see. And I'm almost done. So I want to talk about what's happening right now. So if you don't know, there were 4 executive orders in June of this year from President Trump's office. The 4 were reinvigorating the nuclear industrial base, deploying advanced nuclear reactor technologies for national security, ordering the reform of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and reforming nuclear reactor testing at the Department of Energy. I heard from the Secretary of Energy and the chairman of the NRC just a couple of weeks ago, and they are all on board to do this. And the kind of things, you know, down below there are some of the things that those executive orders say, but it's actually a signal to commercial companies that private investment will actually be a safe investment. So there's a lot more companies involved now, both in advanced reactors and in fuel cycle reprocessing I mentioned, you know, so so converting it from a lab scale, government driven to something that's commercial scale, it feels like that's happening to me. It feels different than it did 5 years ago. So there's a lot of interest here. Maybe you've seen it as well. But, and I think this might be my last slide, other than the takeaways. So why is this important for Washington? So this is a picture of the X-energy reactor that I mentioned, that they're going to build these in Tri-Cities, and this is the fuel. We have Framatome, we have Energy Northwest. We also have the companies like TerraPower, which is Bill Gates' company in Seattle. They're building advanced reactor plants. The first one is going to be built in Wyoming. There were some other ones that kind of failed, like the NuScale, which was started in Portland, Oregon, was going to build a big plant associated with the Utah municipal power systems. There were cost issues that ended up killing that project. And then so this isn't like 100% awesome news. There was another Seattle company called UltraSafe that went bankrupt, but it was bought by another company that's still around. So, Framatome and TerraPower are well positioned. Energy Northwest is really, stepping up. They want to build these new reactors. There's a company called General Matter, that's the uranium enrichment facility, that is still kind of planned. And so there's just a lot happening right now. There's actually a simulator, an operator's control room, basically simulator for these X-energy reactors that's now at the WSU Tri-Cities campus at the Institute for Northwest Energy Futures. So we're trying to figure out what to do, like if there's some programmatic things that we need to do at WSU. Some of the things that we are doing, if you didn't know, we have a nuclear reactor on campus here in Pullman. We make isotopes mainly for security applications as well as industrial applications like well logging. We got some money from the federal government to expand that facility, and we're going to be putting hot cells in there. So the hot cell allows you to process highly radioactive material in a controlled, safe environment. So we have all the money to build the building or build out the reactor building, and that's happening right now. We're waiting on the second iteration of funding to actually build the hot cells. They're being designed right now. So there's lots of discussions at various levels about whether or not we should add degree programs, whether we should add a nuclear engineering program in my unit, whether there should be a nuclear science and engineering program in the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm still a little cautious because we haven't seen the state level support in Washington that other states have seen. I mean, Tennessee and South Carolina are they're just putting giant truckloads of money on the table. So I'm cautious, but I am optimistic. Idaho has a state level task force that they just announced. Texas is pouring tons of money into nuclear. So I don't know it seems positive. We have this waste legacy that we've got to show that we're making progress on, and I think we're finally doing that. And the fact that the Energy Northwest wants to build new reactors, I should say this. Keep in mind that the US, other than 2 large reactors in Georgia, we haven't built any reactors in 50 years in this country. And so I was quite skeptical about all of these new companies that want to build their design, all these small modular reactors designs. But they convinced me, because it's like, if we can't actually build it, like build the structure, regardless of like whether you generate power, if we can't figure out how to do that, the rest of it, forget about it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of private investment going to demonstration projects, and a lot of them are on the Idaho National Lab site, a lot of them are on the Oak Ridge site. Maybe PNL can finally get into this, especially since they're planning to build some actual power reactors, for Energy Northwest in Tri-Cities. So I think that there's still a role for Washington to play, but, that we're going to have some higher level support. It can't be do more, but with less, which is what I've experienced as a department head. I don't know about you
That's the
guys.
WSU model.
Well, that's right.
So, again, I encourage you to continue to educate yourselves about the details here. And these are some of the books that I've highlighted. The one I didn't talk about this time was the one called Strange Glow, which is an interesting, the account there that's interesting is how the fact that we dropped the bombs on Japan has basically taught us almost everything we know about health physics of radiation, of acute exposure. Almost everything we know is based on a longitudinal study of people that were affected in Japan. So that story is told in that book, but I mentioned the other ones already. So that's pretty much all I have for you today. And I've asked I've answered a number of questions already. It's past an hour, so I don't know what the plan is here, but I'm willing to hang around and
Yeah, let's get some people from Zoom on, because we've had a few questions already from here in Pullman. Any questions from Zoom?
Yeah, Tom here. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about the economics of building nuclear energy sites versus other green energies. Is there not a problem there?
So, this is a difficult and highly political question to answer. What I would tell you, based on the kinds of things that I understand and what I heard, and again, it's hard to get good numbers on this, is that the advantage of nuclear power is that these plants are active for a really, really long time. I mean, we have some plants that have been generating power in this country for more than 60 years. And they're licensed, they've been relicensed out to 80 years, many of them. There are some significant advantages to some of the designs, the smaller designs, one of which is you can site one of these things in a remote area. You can size it appropriate for a community. In terms of the cost, in general, the upfront cost is higher. But, for example, siting something in a remote area, you might not need the same level of grid integration that you would need for other power sources. What I've seen is a lot of the cost overruns and things that have been that have occurred over the last decades has to do maybe less with the technology and more with the project management. There's some interesting articles I've read recently by the American Nuclear Society talking about just managing large projects in general, regardless of whether it's nuclear, but large infrastructure projects. How do you get the labor that you need at the times that you need it? How do you get the skilled workers at the time that you need it? How do you develop those relationships with communities to get those things at the right time? So I think there's a lot of optimism and a lot of lessons learned about just construction management that we have now that we didn't really have in the past, where a lot of these things were built in the past and they were just going to get done. There wasn't the same conversation, and again, if you have to replace a solar panel every 20 years or a wind turbine or whatever, and those things are not that many megawatts per per installation. So I think what I heard was the Secretary of Energy say, and I hadn't thought about it this way. Yes, small modular reactors are great for specific reasons. But you're going to have to build some big ones too, because you're not going to be able to get, I don't remember what the number was. I'll make up some number. Add 50 gigawatts of power by 2050 or something like that. You're not going to actually be able to build those big plants fast enough. So they're going to upgrade some. They're going to turn back on some, not decommissioned, but turned off reactors. I don't know if you knew that, but the Palisades in Michigan, I forget exactly where the Palisades was, is actually being turned back on. The 3 Mile Island #2, whichever one it was. This one was super controversial, right? That's 3 Mile Island. I think it was Microsoft that bought all the power from, so there's this conversation about what they're calling hyperscalers, these companies that need a ton of electricity for their data centers. And there's a lot more demand that just won't be able to be accommodated quickly enough with these other kind of energy sources. It might take you a little bit longer to get there, and it might be a little bit more initial investment, but I think in the long term, the capacity factors, the on times, the 24/7 day, night, hot, cold, sun, wind or not, advantage of nuclear is quite strong.
Yeah. Any more questions from Zoom?
One more question. Would you care to comment on the viability of the fusion reactor projects? I've always looked on this type of nuclear energy as sort of a stopgap to fill energy needs over the next 50 years or so, but that it would transfer to fusion reactions. And I might add that when I was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins, half the physics graduates went to places like MIT to work on fusion, and they're mostly retired now. What do you think the viability of fusion, the fusion process is?
Yeah. Thanks for your question, George. And I know something about this. So Washington actually has a lot going on in fusion right now as well. There are at least 3 companies that I know of in the Puget Sound area that are involved in, these are all small companies involved in fusion designs. Now, these are not the giant fusion designs, so there's a lot of different fusion designs. But there's the tokamak, right, which is the big power plant, which is the magnetically confined plasma. And then there's the laser-based fusion, which was demonstrated at the National Ignition Facility recently in the last couple of years. What we have in Washington are the alternate designs. And a lot of these designs were actually, again, like many of our advanced fission reactors, were demonstrated in the 70s, but not pursued. And so there's the one that's the furthest along is called is called Helion. And they're in Everett. And they have already made a deal with Amazon, I think it is, to buy all of their power. And so they have a site, it is licensed, and they are building it around Moses Lake. And so they are very secretive compared to the other ones. So there's a lot of people who are still skeptical of the actual net positive coming out of these. But I think it's a similar argument to the advanced fission reactors, that if you can't build these things fast enough and economically enough, how are you ever going to collect the data you need to actually make it really work economically? And the difference that we've seen is a huge amount of private investment in these fusion companies. And so in the last maybe 4 years, maybe, they've had an annual Fusion Week in Washington. And it's actually one day is at the WSU Tri-Cities campus. And then there's a whole bunch of meetings with other stakeholders, many of whom are government. And I've been to it a couple of times now, and it's usually in October, so it just happened. And there's a lot of optimism, right? There's still a lot of scientists that are skeptical, and I'm one of them that's skeptical of having the materials that can withstand the environments. But the reality is we can't even test those until we build something. We can talk about how they might work, but if you actually build one of these things, then you can run it for a little while, then take it apart and see what happens. And so that's kind of where we're at, I think. I think there's a sort of a similar argument for just doing it and seeing what happens and taking the cue from private investment that this is an important thing to be dumping money into right now. So I'll give you an example of one that I know the most, maybe a little bit about. So there's a company called Commonwealth Fusion Systems, which maybe you know about, which was a spinoff from MIT. It's in somewhere in the East. I think it's in Virginia or something right now. But they are pretty far along. It's a tokamak company. They have figured out how to make money before they actually have their fusion plant. So some of these other companies have figured out how to do this, right? Some of them are like making medical isotopes. I think Commonwealth Fusion System is making magnets because they need these superconductor magnets. And so they've been able to figure out a business model where they can develop part of the technology that they need and actually be solvent. But they have a prototype system, and I've seen this discussed at conferences, and we've actually been on calls with a couple of these guys. They have a prototype that's coming out in the next 2 years, I think, and their full-scale commercial plant they've already started building, and I think 2030 is when that's supposed to be online. Again, will it actually be net positive to the grid? TBD. There's still some fairly significant technical issues with fusion, not least of which is how do you generate the tritium? How do you protect the plant from the tritium? How do you do accountancy, nuclear accountancy? But the regulation piece has been fixed. They figured out how to do that. These fusion reactors are not they're regulated under a different part of the NRC, and in basically the same kind of category that ion accelerators are regulated. So they're not regulated like fission reactors. So there's a path forward, and that's both federally and now in the state of Washington, which enabled them to, site the Moses Lake plant. So I don't know the answer right now, but I really think the next 5 years are going to be very interesting. There may be some spectacular failures. The nail in the coffin will be if there's a spectacular accident. So we can't have that happen. The nuclear community has an amazing safety record. It's just that the times that things have gone wrong, they've gone very wrong, and it's been very public. But I think everyone is very conscious of that, and and in the fusion community as well, they're like, well, you're saying you're going to do this so fast, so fast, so fast. What happens if you fail? Like that affects all of the rest of us and our designs. And they're like, well, we're not going to fail. And the issue is that the people that are running these companies are entrepreneurs, right? They're not really scientists. I mean, they have scientists, but those types of people don't make the best CEOs. I don't know if any of you have started your own company or not, but actually, being a fairly heavy skeptic on some of these things, I hear them talk and they have really good arguments, right? It's like, if we don't do something, then we can't get more private investment to fund you to do the science. And so in the case of fusion, Helion, just in the last month, has put out a call for proposals. How many companies do you know that are putting out a call for proposals to help science and technology for them? And so this is actually really surprising, but I think the way that this country really should go towards, have very applied research that actually can be fundamental, but also can be used by companies. So that's my answer.
Good answer.
Thank you.
Bob, you had a question?
Oh, just a comment quickly. I was up at the Grant County PUD not too long ago, and they told me that they either have or are planning to purchase about 1,000 acres on the Columbia River, I think, outside of the Hanford Reservation, I think. And the whole idea there is to plant SMRs there for a data center. And so they're apparently, even the companies are planning these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So, comment.
I just, to me, when we talk about the repositories, to me, the underlying assumption is we'll never know anything more about nuclear waste than we know right now. So we'll make this permanent repository and just stick it away so don't worry about it. I've often wondered, have they ever looked at, say, make a 500-year retrievable repository, thinking 500 years, we will know more about nuclear physics and maybe we can actually do something.
Yeah, this is a great question. And actually, the answer is we have thought about it. And different countries have different approaches. So, for example, in Finland, it is a disposal site. It's a bury it and forget it mindset. That's their approach. The reason it's called a repository in the US was that we have a requirement right now for retrievability for exactly the reasons that you described. And it's actually like a little bit problematic because it does affect the design of the facility quite significantly. So, for example, whereas a great disposal site is salt, like the waste isolation pilot plant, because it actually, over time, actually squeezes itself and encapsulates everything.
Well, it self-seals.
Right, it self-seals, right? But it's not retrievable, right? So that's why Yucca Mountain was a reasonable engineering solution, because it wasn't going to do that, right? So it was designed to be able to be retrieved. Now, there were other technical issues with it, but just to answer your question, different countries have different approaches to this, but that conversation is still an active conversation in the US. I think most people think that it's a good idea to have an ability to go back and retrieve it at least for a few hundred years, maybe not 10,000 years, but maybe a 500-year retrieval requirement is a good one to have, especially if we're not reprocessing. If we're just putting fuel in there, absolutely, I think you want to be able to go back and get that fuel if you want to. Although over time, the daughter products from the fission products actually make that used fuel a lot less attractive than fresh used fuel from a reprocessing standpoint, from a chemistry standpoint. But that's not to say that there wouldn't be a time where we wouldn't want that. So we are thinking about that still.
Based on the history of materials, basically, the fusion problem of embrittlement, do these modular reactors have the same problem as the hot water reactors do with the hydrogen embrittlement of the materials?
The short answer is I don't know. I think that if you're asking about the fusion reactors or the advanced fission, so certainly that's something we would definitely have to think about for fusion reactors, right? Because you're going to have a lot of tritium around. And so will you have hydride formation? Will you have, tritium-induced embrittlement in some of your metals? Maybe the bigger question in my mind on the materials used for fusion is that because you're talking about astronomical temperatures and huge neutron fluxes in the plasma-facing components, is that we're not using the same materials, right? So hydrogen embrittlement is maybe a problem for steels. We may not be able to use steels for most of these components. And so I think there's, it's certainly not something that we've forgotten about, but it doesn't seem to be the biggest problem. I think the bigger problem for hydrogen or tritium in fusion is if it gets into the material, how do I get it out? Or how do I know how much is in there? Because you have regulations and safety issues on accountancy, right? You have to calculate how many of these atoms are produced, and I need to get some of them back so that I can keep the process going. This breeder blanket thing, I think, is one of the biggest question marks on how these things are going to work.
But I think tritium has a half-life of just 12 years.
Yeah, so it's not like you can produce it and then buy it. I mean, you can make it in a can-do reactor, which, you know, we get most of it from Canada right now. But it's not ever going to be a fuel that you can just buy and put it in. You have to, at least in everything that I've heard, the actual fusion reactor has to have a way to produce its own tritium and then collect it in some way and inject it back. And so if you're capturing a lot of this in your metals, regardless of what it does to the structure, that's really problematic.
So how about the fission side with these smaller modular units? What kind of lifetime of this?
You know, I think, and it's a great question, and it's one that needs to be answered. But I think most of these companies are like, yeah, that's important, but we need to be able to show that we can affordably build something. And then once we've shown that we can affordably build something, let's say of mild steel or whatever, there's a company called Last Energy that is building basically small versions of PWRs, and they have their first one they built at the Texas A&M camp, not on the main campus, but on the Rellis campus, which is in Bryan, Texas. And they're essentially PWRs with no concrete. So they have like a cylinder, and they do this on purpose for scalability and repeatability. And so they've selected some alloy for that. You know, once they've shown that they can make the alloy, they can make this, and they can generate some data, then it's like, okay, well, now we know that's the alloy that we need to go study. The issue is all the materials are all over the place right now, and we don't necessarily know which ones we need to understand. And that's part of the problem with these advanced reactors. There's like 120 designs or something. And so how are you even going to choose what problem to study? And so that's why I think we kind of have to wait and see which horses look like they're going to win, and then find out what they've proposed for their materials and start studying the long-term effects, you know, on some of those materials. So that's my answer to you. It's not a very good answer, I'm afraid, but.
Well, great. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for your time.
That was great. Powerful.
You know, you think about, well, you have a nuclear engineering major and that sort of thing.